The Gallipoli campaign, fought during World War I in 1915, stands as one of the most grueling and tragic battles in military history. The campaign, intended to secure the Dardanelles for the Allied forces, turned into a bloody stalemate in which thousands of Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, ANZAC soldiers, alongside British, French, and Ottoman forces, perished on the shores of the Turkish peninsula. Today, the beaches and hillsides of Gallipoli are quiet, but those who visit often speak of an unsettling presence, a sense that the spirits of those who fought and died there still wander the land. These are the stories of the ghosts of Gallipoli, spirits of the Anzacs, who some say linger at the sites where they fought, bound to the hills and trenches by the horrors they endured. Story 1. The Silent Sentinel of Lone Pine. Lone Pine Cemetery lies quietly on the Gallipoli Peninsula, its white tombstones stark against the Turkish soil. The memorial here marks the site of one of the most intense battles fought by the Australian and New Zealand forces during World War I. It was here, at this pine-covered ridge, that soldiers of the Anzacs engaged in desperate hand-to-hand combat with Ottoman forces, turning the pine grove into a gruesome tableau of sacrifice and valor. The site is tranquil now, the only sounds being the wind rustling through the remaining pines and the faint call of distant birds. But there are those who say that the peace is only surface deep. Underneath, the spirits of the fallen still stand guard, refusing to abandon their post even in death. I first heard the story of the Silent Sentinel from Robert, a historian who has dedicated his life to preserving the stories of the Gallipoli campaign. We met by chance at a gathering held to commemorate the battle's centennial anniversary. Over drinks, Robert shared stories of soldiers who had fought and died on that lonely hillside, and he told me of the strange figure who, according to locals and visiting soldiers, had been seen standing guard at Lone Pine long after the guns fell silent. "Sometimes he's just there," Robert said in a low voice, as if the sentinel might hear him even from half a world away. "He doesn't move or speak, just stands there among the graves, keeping watch over the others. Some say he's a lost soul bound to this place. Others think he's a symbol, a reminder of those who stayed behind." To understand the Silent Sentinel, Robert explained, one must understand the significance of Lone Pine. In August 1915, Anzac forces launched an assault on the heavily fortified Turkish positions atop the ridge. The initial objective was straightforward: distract the Ottoman forces while other Allied units attempted to make headway elsewhere on the peninsula. But the attack soon devolved into a brutal struggle for survival, with soldiers fighting in narrow trenches, often using bayonets, shovels, and even bare hands as weapons. The Turkish defenses were formidable, with complex trench networks covered by pine logs. When the Anzacs broke through, they found themselves trapped in a nightmarish environment where close-quarters combat was the only option. The soldiers fought in a frenzy, slipping on the blood-soaked earth, scrambling over the bodies of their comrades and enemies alike. The intensity of the battle left a profound mark on those who survived, and for many, the memories of Lone Pine haunted them for the rest of their lives. By the end of the assault, thousands lay dead, their bodies intermingled in the narrow trenches. The ground, once covered in pine needles, became a field of sorrow, littered with the fallen. The pines themselves were nearly all destroyed, their trunks splintered by artillery fire, their branches burned away by flames. What had once been a quiet hillside was now a graveyard. Years after the war, the Lone Pine Cemetery was established as a memorial for the soldiers who had perished there. People came from all over the world to pay their respects, to honor the fallen, and to remember the sacrifice made on those hills. And it was during these pilgrimages that the stories of the Silent Sentinel began to emerge. The first recorded sighting of the Silent Sentinel occurred in 1930. An Australian veteran, returning to Gallipoli to honor his fallen comrades, had stayed late at the cemetery, lost in his thoughts as he read the names carved into the white stones. As dusk fell, he noticed a figure standing at the edge of the cemetery. The man wore a World War I uniform, his stance rigid, his face obscured by shadows. The veteran, thinking it was another visitor, called out to him, but the figure did not respond. Instead, he remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if on guard. Intrigued, The veteran approached, but as he drew closer, the figure faded into the twilight, leaving him alone among the gravestones. Shaken, he left the cemetery that evening, convinced he had encountered one of his fallen comrades who had chosen to remain at his post, even in death. In 1998, an Australian soldier named Andrew visited Gallipoli as part of an Anzac Day commemorative service. He had grown up hearing stories of Gallipoli from his grandfather, who had survived the war but had carried the memory of it in his heart until his final days. Andrew felt a personal connection to the place, a sense of duty to honor not only his grandfather, but all those who had fought on those shores. As the day's ceremonies came to an end and the crowds began to disperse, Andrew found himself lingering at the Lone Pine Cemetery. The quiet was a balm to his soul, and he walked among the graves, reading the names and ages of the men who had died, many of them barely older than he was. He felt a pang of sadness, imagining the young lives cut short, the families who had received telegrams bearing the worst news possible. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the white stones, when Andrew saw him. A lone figure standing near the far end of the cemetery, dressed in the uniform of a World War I soldier. At first, Andrew assumed he was a reenactor, someone paying homage to the fallen. But as he watched, he realized there was something strange about the figure. He was unnaturally still, his gaze fixed on something in the distance, as if he were watching over the land. Feeling an inexplicable pull, Andrew walked toward him, his footsteps silent on the grass. As he got closer, he began to notice details that sent a chill through him. The figure's uniform was faded, its fabric torn and stained as if it had seen years of wear. The man's face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were dark, hollow, as if they had witnessed more than any person should. Andrew stopped a few feet away, his heart pounding. He wanted to speak, to ask who this man was, but the words caught in his throat. And then, as if sensing his presence, the figure turned his head slowly, meeting Andrew's gaze. For a moment, Andrew felt as if he were looking into a mirror, as if the figure were a reflection of himself, trapped in time. Then, without a sound, the figure faded, blending into the shadows of the evening. Andrew stood there, shaken, feeling as if he had just glimpsed the soul of Lone Pine itself, a spirit bound to the place by the memory of sacrifice and loss. Robert, the historian who had shared the story with me, spent years researching the identity of the Silent Sentinel, piecing together stories from veterans, visitors, and locals who had encountered the ghostly figure. He was convinced that the Sentinel was not just an apparition, but a real soldier, a man who had fought and died at Lone Pine and whose spirit had never left. Through his research, Robert discovered the story of Private William "Billy" McLeod, a soldier from Melbourne who had served with the ANZACs and died during the assault on Lone Pine. Billy had been known for his bravery, often volunteering for the most dangerous assignments. His letters home, preserved by his family, revealed a young man with a fierce sense of loyalty to his comrades, a man who saw his role in the war as a duty to protect those around him. In his final letter, written just days before the battle, Billy had expressed a haunting premonition. "I feel that this place has a hold on me, that I am bound to it in ways I cannot explain. If I fall here, know that I will be standing guard, watching over the boys who went before and the ones who come after." Robert believed that Billy's words were prophetic, that his spirit had indeed remained at Lone Pine, fulfilling the promise he had made in life. For those who encountered the Silent Sentinel, the sense of duty and loyalty that defined Billy McLeod was palpable, a presence that transcended time and death. On the 100th anniversary of the Gallipoli landings in 2015, thousands gathered at Lone Pine to pay tribute to the fallen. The ceremony was solemn, with dignitaries, veterans, and descendants of the soldiers standing side by side, their heads bowed in respect. As the sun rose over the peninsula, casting a golden light over the cemetery, a sense of peace settled over the crowd. Among those present was a young Australian woman named Emily, whose great-grandfather had fought and died at Gallipoli. She had come to honor his memory, to stand where he had stood, to feel the weight of history that her family had carried for generations. As the ceremony ended, Emily lingered at the cemetery, lost in thought as she walked among the gravestones. She was about to leave when she noticed a figure standing at the edge of the cemetery, dressed in an old military uniform. At first, she thought he was part of the commemoration, a reenactor paying his respects. But as she watched, she felt an odd sense of familiarity, a feeling that she couldn't quite place. The man was tall and slender, his face solemn, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Emily took a few steps toward him, her heart beating faster as she got closer. She wanted to call out, to ask who he was, but something held her back. It was as if an invisible barrier separated them, a boundary that could not be crossed. The figure turned to look at her, his eyes meeting hers with a look of deep, unspoken sorrow. Emily felt a rush of emotion, a connection that defied explanation. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, leaving her standing alone among the graves. Emily left Lone Pine that day with a heavy heart, but also with a sense of peace. She felt as if she had met her great-grandfather, or perhaps another soldier like him, someone who had stayed behind to watch over those who followed. She would carry the memory of that encounter with her, a reminder of the sacrifices made and the spirits who still lingered, bound to the land by loyalty and loss. The silent sentinel of Lone Pine is more than just a ghost story. He is a symbol of the enduring spirit of the Anzacs, a presence that reminds visitors of the sacrifices made on that hill. For those who believe, he is a guardian, a soul who remains bound to the land by a sense of duty that transcends life and death. His figure stands as a testament to the bravery and loyalty of those who fought and died at Gallipoli, a reminder that some spirits are too devoted to ever truly leave. Today, as visitors walk among the graves of Lone Pine, they might catch a glimpse of him out of the corner of their eye, a lone figure standing watch over his fallen comrades, a silent sentinel who will never abandon his post. And for those who feel his presence, there is a quiet comfort in knowing that the spirits of Gallipoli are not forgotten, that they remain, bound to the land they loved and the friends they lost. Story 2. The Whispering Winds of the Neck. The Neck is a narrow strip of land perched high above the cliffs of Gallipoli, a place where the very air seems charged with the weight of tragedy. On August 7, 1915, this ridge became the site of one of the most infamous and heartbreaking moments in the Gallipoli campaign. In the early dawn, the men of the Australian 8th and 10th Light Horse Brigades were ordered to charge across the open ground, facing directly into the line of fire from well-entrenched Ottoman machine guns. Wave after wave of soldiers ran forward, each met with a barrage of bullets that tore through their ranks. The assault was doomed from the start, a sacrifice of human lives for a few yards of ground. In less than an hour, hundreds of men lay dead or wounded, the ground stained with their blood, their bodies intertwined in death where they had fallen. The Neck remains a haunting place today. Quiet and windswept, the land a memorial to those who perished. But visitors and locals alike speak of the whispering winds, a strange phenomenon that occurs on calm days when faint voices seem to drift through the air, carried on the wind like the echoes of the past. Ahmet, a Turkish man in his 60s, has spent most of his life guiding visitors through the Gallipoli battlefields. His knowledge of the area is unparalleled, and he speaks of the soldiers, both Allied and Ottoman, with a reverence that honors their sacrifice. During a guided tour of the Neck, one misty morning, I noticed Ahmet growing quiet, his normally animated face turning solemn as he gazed out over the ridge. When the tour ended, I asked him about the silence, about the stories of voices that some had heard on the wind. At first, he seemed hesitant, but then he shared a memory, a story he rarely told strangers. It had been a calm spring day, just a few years ago, when Ahmet was leading a small group of tourists along the ridge. The group had paused near a marker commemorating the Australian soldiers who had fallen, and as Ahmet spoke about the charge, he noticed a strange stillness in the air. The wind, which usually whipped through the narrow pass, had died down completely, leaving an almost unnatural silence. Then, softly, he began to hear it, a faint, whispering sound, like voices carried on the breeze. At first, he thought it was the wind rustling through the grass, but the voices grew clearer, more distinct. He could make out snatches of words in English, fragments of orders shouted, names called, and cries of pain that sent a chill down his spine. Ahmet looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. The tourists continued their conversations, unaware of the spectral voices. For a moment, he felt as if he were standing on the edge of two worlds, one foot in the present and one in the past. And in that instant, he could almost see them. The soldiers charging forward, their faces etched with determination and fear, their bodies falling as the gunfire cut them down. When the voices faded, Ahmet was left with a profound sadness, a sense of loss that lingered long after the wind returned. He never spoke of it to anyone, but he knew that what he had heard was real, a reminder that the men who had died on that ridge were not truly gone. In 2015, a young Australian woman named Sarah traveled to Gallipoli with a group of friends to honor the centenary of the campaign. She had always felt a deep connection to the Anzac soldiers, having grown up hearing stories of Gallipoli from her grandfather, who had lost friends in the war. The visit was meant to be a pilgrimage, a chance to pay her respects and connect with the history of her country. On the morning of August 7th, the group visited the Neck, where the infamous charge had taken place exactly 100 years earlier. The sky was a pale blue, and the air was still, with a quietness that felt almost reverent. Sarah walked along the ridge, taking in the beauty of the landscape, her heart heavy as she imagined the soldiers who had once stood where she was standing. As she approached the edge of the ridge, she stopped, feeling a strange energy in the air. It was as if the ground itself was vibrating, resonating with an invisible force. She closed her eyes, listening to the silence, and then she heard it, a faint whisper, drifting through the air like a memory brought to life. The sound was so soft that at first she thought she was imagining it. But as she focused, the whispers grew louder, and she could make out voices, words of encouragement, desperate shouts, the names of fallen friends. Her heart pounded as she listened, a chill running down her spine as the voices seemed to draw her into their world, a place where time had stopped, where the charge was still happening over and over. She opened her eyes, expecting to see the empty hillside, but for a brief moment, she saw something else, shadowy figures running across the ridge, their outlines faint and transparent, their faces blurred but filled with a fierce determination. They moved as if in slow motion, their bodies almost merging with the landscape, and then, just as suddenly, they were gone, leaving her standing alone in the quiet. Sarah felt a profound sadness, a weight that pressed down on her heart. She knew that she had glimpsed something beyond the physical, that the voices and figures she had seen were echoes of the past, a haunting reminder of the lives that had been lost. She left the Neck that day with a newfound respect for the soldiers who had fought there, and a feeling that their spirits were still watching, still waiting for peace. In the late 1960s, Jack, an Australian veteran of World War II, visited Gallipoli to pay homage to the men who had fought in the previous generation's conflict. Jack had grown up idolizing his uncle, who had been one of the few survivors of the charge at the Neck. His uncle had returned from the war a changed man, haunted by memories of friends who hadn't been as fortunate. Jack remembered how his uncle would sit in silence on Anzac Day, staring into the distance, his face lined with grief. Jack felt a sense of duty to visit Gallipoli, to stand on the ground where his uncle had fought, to understand the weight of the legacy that his family carried. On his first morning at the Neck, he arrived early, before the tour groups and visitors crowded the site. The air was crisp, the sky a soft shade of pink as the sun rose over the peninsula. Jack walked slowly along the ridge, his mind filled with images of the stories his uncle had told him, the chaos, the smoke, the sound of gunfire and screams. As he stood there, lost in thought, he felt a sudden chill, a change in the air that made him shiver. And then, faintly, he heard it. The sound of men running, the clinking of gear, the soft, rhythmic beat of boots hitting the ground. He closed his eyes, feeling as if he were standing among them, his senses filled with the echoes of the past. The sound grew louder, and Jack could hear voices, men calling out, orders shouted, names spoken in desperation. He opened his eyes, and for a brief moment he saw them. Ghostly figures charging across the ridge, their forms blurred but unmistakable. He could see their faces, young and determined, filled with a mixture of fear and bravery, their eyes fixed on a goal they would never reach. The figures moved as if caught in a loop, their bodies falling as invisible bullets struck them down, their spirits reliving the charge in an endless cycle. Jack felt a tear slip down his cheek, his heart breaking for these men who had given everything for a few yards of ground. He reached out as if to touch them, but his hand passed through empty air, the figures dissolving into the mist. Jack left the neck that day with a heavy heart, but also a sense of understanding. He knew that the spirits of the soldiers were still there, bound to the land by the trauma of their final moments. He returned to Australia with a renewed dedication to honoring their memory, to ensuring that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. The Whispering Winds of the Neck are more than just a ghost story. They are a haunting reminder of the sacrifice made by those who fought and died in one of the most tragic battles of the Gallipoli campaign. For those who believe, the whispers are a message from the past, a call to remember the young men who charged into death with courage and conviction. The Neck remains a sacred place, a site where the echoes of the past linger, where the voices of the fallen drift through the air like a ghostly chorus. As visitors stand on that ridge today, they may feel the same chill, the same sense of presence that Amit, Sarah, and Jack experienced. And if they listen closely, they might hear the whispers too, a faint, mournful sound carried on the wind. The voices of men who are still charging, still calling out, their spirit forever entwined with the land they died defending. Story 3. The Ghostly Nurse of Anzac Cove. Anzac Cove, a narrow beach nestled beneath the cliffs of the Gallipoli Peninsula, was where the soldiers of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps first landed on April 25, 1915. The cove quickly transformed from a peaceful shore to a makeshift hospital, where the wounded and dying lay in the sand, tended by field medics and volunteer nurses who risked their lives to ease the suffering. Here, amidst the chaos and relentless bombardment, one figure emerged as a beacon of compassion, a nurse named Alice, whose dedication to her patients made her a legend among the soldiers. Decades after the campaign, stories began to circulate of a spectral nurse who could be seen at Anzac Cove, her white uniform glowing faintly in the moonlight as she moved among the shadows. The soldiers and visitors who encountered her described her as a comforting presence, an angel watching over the men who had fallen. It was a tale I first heard from Thomas, a veteran who had visited Gallipoli in his later years. As he spoke of his experience, his voice trembled with reverence, and I could tell that he believed he had truly encountered the ghostly nurse of Anzac Cove. Alice Summers was one of the first volunteer nurses to arrive at Gallipoli, a young woman from New Zealand who had felt a deep calling to serve. She was known for her courage, her unyielding dedication, and her kindness, traits that endeared her to the soldiers she cared for. She worked tirelessly, often going without sleep for days on end, her hands steady, even as shells exploded nearby. Her voice a calm reassurance for the wounded men who clung to her presence in their darkest hours. Alice's work was not just that of a nurse, it was that of a guardian, a silent protector who stayed by the sides of her patients until the very end. She would whisper to them, tell them stories of home, hold their hands as they slipped away. And when they did, she would close their eyes and say a quiet prayer, hoping to bring them peace in death. But Alice's own life was cut tragically short. During a bombing raid, she was struck by shrapnel, her injuries too severe for even her fellow nurses to save her. She died on the shore of Anzac Cove, surrounded by the men she had sworn to protect, her hands still stained with the blood of those she had tended. After her death, the soldiers spoke of her as an angel, a spirit whose devotion to her patients was so strong that even death could not separate her from her duty. In 1965, Thomas, a New Zealand veteran of World War II, made his pilgrimage to Gallipoli to honor those who had come before him. He had heard of Alice Summers from his father, who had served alongside her at Anzac Cove. His father had told him tales of the nurse who never left a soldier's side, who stayed with the dying until they took their last breaths, her presence a comfort to the men facing the unknown. The visit was emotional for Thomas, who felt a profound connection to the cove where so many had perished. He walked along the beach in silence, the weight of the past pressing heavily on him. As he approached the shoreline, where the waves lapped gently against the sand, he felt a strange warmth, comforting presence that seemed to wrap around him like a blanket. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel the peace that had settled over him. And then he felt it, a soft, gentle hand on his shoulder. The touch was warm, reassuring, and he could feel the faintest pressure as if someone were standing beside him. He turned, expecting to see a fellow visitor or guide, but there was no one there. Confused, he looked around, but the beach was empty, the only sound the whisper of the waves. As he stood there, he remembered his father's stories, and he knew, deep down, that he had been touched by Alice's spirit, the nurse who had never abandoned her post. He left Anzac Cove that day with a feeling of gratitude, believing that Alice had offered him a silent blessing, a gesture of compassion that transcended time. In 2002, a young Australian medic named Sarah was stationed in Turkey as part of a humanitarian mission. On a day off, she visited Anzac Cove, curious about the place her grandfather had spoken of with such reverence. The beach was quiet that afternoon, the sky overcast, casting a gray light over the sand and rocks. Sarah walked along the shore, feeling a sense of history and loss that was almost overwhelming. She could imagine the chaos, the pain, the desperate cries for help that must have filled the air during the campaign. She paused by the water's edge, lost in thought, when she felt a sudden chill, followed by a strange warmth that seemed to surround her. As she stood there, she heard a soft voice, a woman's voice, murmuring words she couldn't quite understand. The voice was calm, soothing, filled with a gentle kindness that put her at ease. She looked around, expecting to see someone nearby, but the beach was empty. The warmth grew stronger, and Sarah felt a presence standing beside her, a comforting, invisible hand that seemed to rest lightly on her arm. She felt a wave of peace wash over her, a sense that she was not alone, that someone was watching over her. She closed her eyes, letting herself be enveloped in the warmth, and in that moment, she understood. When she opened her eyes, the warmth faded, and the beach was silent once more. Sarah left Anzac Cove with a sense of awe, convinced that she had encountered the spirit of Alice, the ghostly nurse who still tended to those in need, even long after her own death. In 1995, Dr. James Carter, a historian and physician, traveled to Gallipoli to conduct research for a book on the battlefield nurses. He was particularly interested in the story of Alice Summers, whose name appeared in several soldiers' letters and diaries, always mentioned with gratitude and admiration. Dr. Carter spent days combing through the archives, piecing together Alice's story, hoping to understand the impact she had on the men she had cared for. One night, after a long day of research, he decided to visit Anzac Cove. The beach was deserted, the moon casting a silvery glow over the water. He sat on a rock near the shoreline, reading through a letter written by one of Alice's patients, a young soldier who had died shortly after she had cared for him. The letter described Alice's kindness, her soft voice, and the way she had held his hand as he slipped into unconsciousness. As Dr. Carter read, he felt a strange sensation, a warmth that seemed to settle around him as if someone were standing beside him. He looked up, and for a fleeting moment, he saw her. A woman in a white nurse's uniform, her face calm and serene, her hands clasped as if in prayer. Her figure was faint, almost transparent, but he could make out her eyes, filled with a deep compassion that seemed to reach into his soul. She looked at him, her gaze steady, and in that instant he felt as if she knew him, as if she were aware of his presence and his purpose. Then, as silently as she had appeared, she faded into the night, leaving him alone with the sound of the waves. Dr. Carter spent the rest of the night on the beach, unable to shake the feeling that he had been in the presence of something sacred. He left Gallipoli with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to honor Alice's memory and share her story with the world. The ghostly nurse of Anzac Cove is more than just a legend. She is a testament to the compassion and dedication of the battlefield nurses who cared for the fallen with courage and grace. For those who have encountered her, Alice is a guardian, a spirit who remains bound to the place where she gave everything for her patients. Her presence at Anzac Cove serves as a reminder that love and compassion endure beyond death, that even in the midst of horror, there is kindness and hope. Today, as visitors walk along the quiet shores of Anzac Cove, they may feel a warmth, a gentle touch, a sense that they are not alone. For those who believe, Alice is still there, watching over the land she once walked, tending to the spirits of the fallen, and offering comfort to those who seek solace in the echoes of the past. Story 4. The Apparition of Chinook Bear. Chinook Bear is a place of great significance in the history of the Gallipoli campaign, a ridge that stands like a sentinel over the battlefield. For the Allied forces, Chinook Bear was a vital objective, a high vantage point that, if captured, would allow them to control a large swath of the peninsula. But capturing it proved to be a monumental task. On August 6, 1915, after days of relentless assault, New Zealand troops seized the ridge, only to face a brutal Ottoman counterattack that left thousands dead and wounded. The ridge was soon reclaimed by Ottoman forces, turning Chinook Bear into a graveyard for those who had fought to hold it. Today, Chinook Bear is a quiet, windswept hill, marked by memorials to the soldiers who fought and died there. But for those who have visited, it is also a place haunted by memories and shadows. Locals and visitors alike speak of a spectral figure that appears at dawn, a lone soldier standing on the ridge, as if still guarding the battlefield. This ghostly sentinel is said to be one of the Anzac soldiers who fought and died on Chinook Bear, a spirit bound to the land by his final duty. In 2005, a Turkish soldier named Mustafa was assigned to stand guard at Chinook Bear during a dawn memorial ceremony. He had heard stories of ghosts from the locals, tales of strange apparitions that appeared at sunrise, figures that seemed to fade in and out of existence. But Mustafa, a practical man with little patience for ghost stories, dismissed these tales as folklore, the product of overactive imaginations and local superstition. As the first light of dawn began to spread over the ridge, Mustafa completed his patrol, his footsteps soft on the damp grass. The air was cool, filled with the scent of earth and pine, and the only sound was the faint rustle of the breeze. He was about to return to his post when he noticed a figure standing at the edge of the ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun. The figure was tall, his stance rigid, his back straight, as if he were standing at attention. Mustafa's first thought was that it was one of the dignitaries who had arrived early for the ceremony, but something about the man's uniform seemed odd. The fabric looked worn and faded, its color indistinct in the morning light, and the man's posture had a strange stillness, as if he were more statue than human. Mustafa approached cautiously, calling out in Turkish, but the figure did not respond. Instead, he raised his hand in a slow salute, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Mustafa felt a chill run down his spine, a sense that he was witnessing something beyond the ordinary, something that defied explanation. And then, as the sun rose fully over the ridge, the figure faded, dissolving into the light like a shadow at dawn. Mustafa stood there, shaken, his heart pounding as he tried to process what he had seen. He returned to his post that morning with a newfound respect for the battlefield, convinced that he had encountered one of the fallen soldiers, a spirit who had never left his watch. In 1970, a New Zealand veteran named Harold returned to Gallipoli to visit Chinook Bear, where his brother had died during the campaign. Harold was a survivor of the war himself, but the memories of Chinook Bear had haunted him for decades. His brother, only 19 at the time, had been one of the men who had fought to hold the ridge during the brutal counterattack, his life cut short by a single bullet. Harold climbed the ridge at dawn, hoping to find a sense of closure, a way to say goodbye to the brother he had lost. As he reached the summit, he stood silently, his gaze fixed on the memorial, his heart heavy with grief and remembrance. The sky was a pale pink, the first rays of sunlight casting a soft glow over the ridge, and for a moment he felt a sense of peace. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure standing a few yards away, his back to Harold, his posture straight and formal. The man wore a tattered New Zealand uniform, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his gaze directed toward the rising sun. Harold's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the figure, a young man with the same build, the same stance as his brother. Harold took a step forward, calling out his brother's name, but the figure did not move. He seemed frozen in time, locked in a perpetual vigil, his duty unfulfilled. And as the sun rose higher, the figure began to fade, his outline growing faint until he was nothing more than a shadow in the morning light. Harold left Chinook Bear that day with a profound sense of sorrow, but also with a feeling of closure. He believed he had seen his brother's spirit, a soul still bound to the ridge, standing watch over the land he had died defending. For Harold, it was a final farewell, a last glimpse of the young man he had loved and lost. In 2014, a young Australian woman named Emma visited Gallipoli as part of a guided tour. She had always been fascinated by the history of the campaign, and Chinook Bear held a special place in her heart, as her great-grandfather had fought there as part of the New Zealand forces. The tour group arrived at the ridge just before dawn, and Emma stood quietly by the memorial, watching as the sky began to lighten. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, Emma noticed a faint shape standing on the edge of the ridge, a figure barely visible in the dim light. She assumed it was one of the other tourists, but as the sun rose higher, she realized that the figure was dressed in an old military uniform, its fabric faded and worn. The figure stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the distance, his stance that of a soldier standing guard. Emma felt a chill, a shiver that ran down her spine as she watched him, her mind racing with questions. She took a step forward, intending to get a closer look, but as she moved, the figure seemed to dissolve into the light, fading into the air like mist. The experience left Emma shaken, her heart heavy with a mixture of awe and sorrow. She felt as if she had witnessed a moment out of time, a glimpse of the past that had somehow remained, a soldier who had never abandoned his duty. She returned to Australia with a story that would stay with her forever, a memory of the ghostly sentinel who still watched over Chinook Bear. In 1995, on the 80th anniversary of the Gallipoli landings, a Turkish historian named Mehmet organized a dawn ceremony at Chinook Bear, inviting descendants of both Ottoman and Allied soldiers to honor the men who had fought and died on the ridge. The ceremony was solemn, a quiet gathering of people united by a shared history, a shared loss. As the sun rose, Mehmet stood near the edge of the ridge, lost in thought. He was about to speak when he noticed a figure standing a short distance away, a man in a worn uniform, his back straight, his gaze steady. Mehmet's breath caught as he recognized the figure from the stories he had heard, the tales of the ghostly soldier who appeared at dawn. The figure raised his hand in a slow, dignified salute, his eyes filled with a deep sorrow, a weight that seemed to encompass all the suffering of the battlefield. Mehmet felt a tear slip down his cheek, his heart aching for the man who had never left his post, who had remained on the ridge, bound by a duty that transcended death. As the sun rose higher, the figure faded, leaving Mehmet standing alone, his mind filled with the stories of the fallen, the men who had given everything on this hill. The ceremony continued, but Mehmet was haunted by the vision, a final farewell to the soldier who had never left Chinook Bear. The apparition of Chinook Bear is a haunting reminder of the soldiers who fought and died on that ridge, men whose spirits may still linger, bound to the land by their final duty. For those who believe, the ghostly figure who appears at dawn is a guardian, a sentinel who watches over the battlefield. His presence a testament to the courage and sacrifice of those who stood on Chinook Bear. As visitors walk the quiet paths of Chinook Bear today, they may feel a chill in the air, a sense of presence that defies explanation. And if they are lucky, they might catch a glimpse of the spectral soldier, a lone figure standing watch over the ridge, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his duty unbroken, his spirit forever tied to the land he died defending. The ghosts of Gallipoli are more than just legends. They are the spirits of men and women who gave everything in a battle that cost so many lives. From the silent sentinel of Lone Pine to the nurse at Anzac Cove, the apparitions of Gallipoli serve as haunting reminders of the bravery and sacrifice that took place on that desolate peninsula. The soldiers, nurses, and those who cared for the wounded remain bound to the land by memories and the enduring loyalty they held for their comrades. As visitors walk the quiet paths of Gallipoli today, the voices and presences of the past remind them that the cost of war is not only measured in battles won or lost, but in lives and stories that linger long after the final gunshot has faded.